Developing a composition for a painting is one of the most important steps in the painting process. It's one of those elements that can make or break your painting. It's critical, and in order to develop an eye for composition design, you need to make sure you understand some of the important concepts that relate to landscape, such as what makes landscape painting unique, how to view the scene in terms of planes, how a composition leads your eye, design do's and don'ts, and methods used by some of the great masters. This video touches on all of these topics and then concludes with a helpful review. But let's go back to the beginning and lay the foundation. There are some broad concepts that need to be discussed before we can delve into the details of composition. The first concept deals with how landscape differs from other subject matter, such as still life or portraiture. There are things that the landscape painter has to consider or work with that artists working in other subjects don't really have to worry about. I'm specifically talking about atmosphere, weather, sunlight, and land features. These are all things that are unique to landscape. Let's take a brief look at each one. Atmosphere is basically the sky, the air. It's that almost invisible layer that sits between the ground and outer space. It's invisible at a close range, but the atmosphere greatly affects the visual world around you when seen at a distance or under certain atmospheric conditions. There are actually tiny little particles of matter that make up the atmosphere, and that causes, when seen in mass, distant objects and features to become increasingly hazy and increasingly cool in tone the farther they get from you. So the farther they are from you, the more particles of atmosphere sit between you and the object. And this is a factor that has to be taken into consideration as a landscape painter. Weather is another condition that other subjects don't really have to deal with. Weather conditions can really affect the mood of the day. Whether you have a sunny or a rainy or a foggy day, each one carries a different emotional feeling. Sunlight is another thing you have to think about, and it's obviously related to weather and atmosphere in that each one affects the light and how it's filtered. Atmosphere and weather both affect the strength or the intensity of the light and shadows. If it's foggy, your shadows are going to be less dramatic. And if it's very sunny, value contrast will be increased. Sunlight also has a color temperature. Morning light tends to be a cool light, and afternoon light warm. And finally, landforms or land features. That's something that really most other subjects don't worry about. And by this I mean your mountains, your trees, your rocks, even your water. The other overarching landscape topic that I wanted to touch on comes from a book by John F. Carlson that was put out in 1973 called Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting. It's very popular even today. And in it, he theorizes that the landscape or nature can be broken down into a series of planes. This is very helpful, and I want to review it with you. However, I also want you to keep in mind that it's a theory, not a perfect science. There are many exceptions, and I'll show you a few. But what I like about it is the fact that it trains your brain to think of what you see in nature as physical planes. You'll see what I mean as we move along. Now, Carlson's theory deals with 4 planes. You have the light source, which is the sky, and you have the slanting features, which would be the mountains. You have your upright features, for example, trees, and then you have your flat plane, which would be the ground. Carlson's theory is based on the fact that, according to him, objects receive different amounts of light according to their plane. So a slanting mountain will not catch quite as much light as the ground, which is horizontal to the sky. And perpendicular objects receive even less light, so they end up as your darkest value. Now, why is all of this useful to you? I would say basically, it just helps you simplify your scene. It helps you take the landscape in front of you and break it down into workable groupings, or in this case, planes. It's a concept that's good to store in the back of your mind, and over time will subtly help you be more effective in deciphering what you see in nature. Now, as we mentioned before, there are a lot of exceptions to this. For example, as we see here, we have the leafless trees, the aspens, and they glow. They are almost the lightest value. And in this scene, the direction of the sunlight is causing the mountain on the right to be in deeper shade. So you have two mountains conveying two different values. And notice that snow is an exception as well, because it's so very white. And lastly, sometimes when the sun is setting, it will shine upon a mountainside, and that value will become one of the lighter values in the scene. So be aware of this whole theory, and it may be useful to you, but know that there are plenty of exceptions. Now, I've taken Carlson's theory and applied different verbiage to it just to make it a little more palatable to the landscape painter of today. Let's take a look. First, you have the distant background. These are the very distant mountains, and they tend to be darker than the sky, but one of the lighter values in the scene. Next, you have the background, which would be the closer mountains. These would be the slanted plains, and they are probably the next darkest value. We have the foreground, which is the plane that's horizontal to the sky and reflects more of the light. Therefore, it is a lighter value, maybe just a little darker than the very distant mountains. You also have the perpendicular objects, which are clearly some of the darkest values in the scene. And then the sky, which is obviously the lightest value that you have, although there are exceptions. Take a look at it in black and white. You can really see the value differences when you take away the color. Now that we've discussed some of the broader concepts, let's delve into the subject of composition design. And it all starts with determining how a composition leads the eye. When examining a scene, you need to determine a focal point and then figure out how the lines in the picture lead your eye. You may choose an object as your focal point, or you may just pick part of the scene, such as the end of a path or road. Or sometimes you're just going for an overall mood or feeling. In the scene you see here, I wanted to focus on the graceful lines that you see in the branches. Now, one of the things that attracted me to this particular shot was the nice triangular shape that guided my eye to my chosen focal point. Now, I usually make these judgments when I see the images on my computer. When you see the photos, you should pay attention to how your eye moves through the scene, and that will tell you whether it's going to lead the viewer where you want to lead them, which is, again, to the focal point. Let's look at another example. Here you have a road that leads towards the sunlit area, and part of the mountains lead there too. You're basically following the natural lines of the scene to see where they lead the eye. So that's how you examine the scenes when you're looking for reference material or composition material. Now that we briefly discussed land features and the importance of how elements lead your eye, let's talk about some do's and don'ts, and then we'll discuss some common design tools. But first, I want you to keep in mind that these are just meant to be helpful guides. These aren't meant to box you into rules. Many, if not most times, your composition will be the result of gut reaction. But training your eye for common errors and workable formats will help you make future decisions and help you evaluate problematic compositions. So let's take a look at 2 common don'ts. The first don't is don't split your painting in half. Now, just so that you know these rules are not set in stone, look at this piece by Paul Cézanne. Cézanne splits his canvas in half with this tree. Is it pleasing? Well, it's not something I would have done, but I'm not going to argue with Cézanne. Just keep in mind that for every rule, there's probably a painting out there that successfully breaks it. Another common rule is, don't place your focal point at exactly the center of your painting. It happens that Renoir has broken that rule and successfully gets away with it. As you can see, if you place crosshairs dividing up the painting, and then you circle the center, you find that he put his figure right in the middle, and he makes it work. Now, here are 2 helpful do's that you might want to keep in mind. The first one is, try to use an odd number of elements, especially if your elements are going to be very obvious. The second one is, remember to vary the sizes and the space between the elements. Think unity with diversity. In the painting we're looking at, Corot does a fantastic job varying his elements and still maintaining unity. Now we're going to discuss some of the tools that are commonly used in composition design, and we'll use works from some of the great masters as examples. The first one we're going to talk about is the rule of thirds. This is a very popular design format, and it involves dividing up your canvas or your paper into thirds, both horizontally and vertically. The theory is that if you place your prime objects, or even your focal point, where the lines intersect or along the lines, you'll have a successful composition. If you've heard of the golden ratio or the golden point, there are a number of names. That is similar to the rule of thirds, but I find the rule of thirds much easier to understand. Another tool at your disposal is where you place the horizon line. You can follow the rule of thirds and place it at the third markers horizontally, or you can go a little extreme with your horizon line. In this painting, you can see that Cuyp has placed his horizon line below the quarter page marker. If you make a very extreme horizon line, it does kind of give it a visual interest, doesn't it? Here, Cuyp has his cows gazing to the right. He also has the clouds lining up in such a way that it guides your eye to the small boat in the right-hand corner. Andrew Wyeth's painting, Christina's World, is a really good example of a high horizon line. It's actually a very high horizon line. He places it above the quarter marker, just like we saw in the previous painting. He also lines up her body posture in such a way that it directs you to the house, just as the road in the upper right-hand corner does. It's almost a strong diagonal, which we discuss later. Another design tool that you can use is the L shape, which William Trost Richards' painting here is a great example of. Lining up your elements in an L shape can create a very pleasing composition. But notice that he has a tiny ship placed along the horizon. This is what seems to be his focal point. The L acts almost like a frame that accentuates the tiny boat. The S shape, also called the Z shape, is a very popular tool, and I actually use it a lot. It's often used for painting roads and rivers, like you can see in this painting. I think it's popular because it just naturally leads the eye. It's very effective. Seurat's painting is a great example of a strong diagonal, but you have to be careful about how you line up your elements in order to convey the diagonal successfully. Seurat was able to pull that off, but I think we're better served by doing something a little more subtle, like what you see here with Andrew Wyeth. It's still a strong diagonal, but he's a little more creative with it. Using a large center object is another tool, but you do also have to be careful with this one. Notice that William Trost Richards, in a kind of reversal, instead of a large dark object, he's put the sun and the reflective sun in the middle as a large object. This seems to contradict the rule we discussed earlier about not placing your focal point directly in the center, but there are many situations where you can do it. In fact, if you're featuring a figure or a key object, or in some of my paintings, a tree, as long as you line up the supporting objects properly and you give the viewer elements of interest, it can really work. Symmetrical balance is almost self-explanatory. There's a balance in the composition, whether it's your focal points or individual elements of your painting. I think symmetry can be used to convey a calm and a peacefulness, kind of a controlled element in your painting. Triangulation is one of my favorite tools. I think it's one of the most effective tools too, and a lot of paintings use it. Whether it's used for the whole composition like we see here, or just in elements. I usually use it when I put figures in the scene. There's almost always a little triangulation because it's very pleasing to the eye, just like the S curve is kind of naturally pleasing. Your eye likes to know where to go. And so if you have 3 points where your eye can kind of, I hate to say circle, but it bounces from point to point, it's a very effective tool in painting. So let's take a look at when to use these tools. Well, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, it's helpful to have knowledge about all of these tools and rules in order to develop an eye. You also will be able to use these tools when you have trouble with your composition. So, for example, when I come home and download the images onto my computer, sometimes I'll get the perfect shot, and as soon as I see that photograph, I know it's going to work. It leads my eye directly to the focal point and everything just kind of falls into place. But there are plenty of times when the photographs don't work. And that's when we pull in our design tools. Up to this point, we've discussed features that are unique to landscape painting, how to see the scene in terms of planes, how the lines of a landscape can lead the eye, typical do's and don'ts, and common design tools. These topics all help prepare your eye for the next step in the process, which is the photo shoot. This is where you gather your reference material, after which there's the issue of reconstructing troubled compositions. The goal for the process is to end up with a painting composition that has the greatest chance of success. Let's end the video with a quick review, plus some additional examples of design tools. See if you can spot each tool before it's revealed.